Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. This is the third in our series of the RIBA Studio Tutor Symposiums, and today I'm really pleased to welcome Maria Faraone, the Programme Director for RIBA Studio, and Justin Chapman, who's our subject lead for technology. And today we're talking about the role of architecture beyond buildings making place. So I'm going to just let you know we're recording this session, and we will put it on our YouTube channel afterwards. Hello to anyone who's joining us on catch up that way as well. I'm going to hand straight over to Justin, who's going to be starting off this presentation.
Hello everyone, hopefully you can all hear me. So I'm Justin Chapman, as Joanna said. I'm subject lead for technology on the RIBA Studio. I also teach on the full-time course at Oxford Brookes. I'm an alumni of the RIBA Studio diploma course, and I'm also a practicing architect. And today what I'm going to talk about is a project which I've been working on for about 5 to 6 years, and which there's lots of sort of paths that have crossed in doing that project, and some of the things that I think about in teaching and what we do as architects working in the rural environment. So bear with me while I share my screen. I'll be followed up by after I've spoken by Maria. Maria, do you want to just say hi so that your face comes to the forefront? Yeah.
Sure. Just hello everybody. I'm Maria, and we work together on the RIBA Studio. I'm the director of the RIBA Studio. I'm an academic as well at Brookes. I'm also a practicing architect, and we're tag teaming today on a similar and very different topic afterwards. Yeah. So thank you, Justin. Thank you for taking the lead.
Thank you. So this project is about a new home for Richard and Sue, and it's based in the Blackdown Hills in Devon, and it's a house for a retired couple, retired farmers who've lived in this community for quite a few years and are changing their pace of life and activity and where they live and so on. And this is going to be a home for them. And this talk is going to be about some of the processes in designing a house for this type of a setting, and thinking about the things to do with place, which are can be contributed to by a building of this type, and how a building of this type can read place as well at the same time. It's not going to be a chronology of the project, or it's not going to talk about the whole story of it, or all sorts of things which are all really interesting subjects which could cover all sorts of other talks and discussions, but it's going to be focusing about the things to do with the technology informed design of the building. So this is where it's built. It's on a green field in the Blackdown Hills in Devon. Amazing site. Building in a site like this, I started with a simple question: what am I building in a landscape? And when I'm recognizing that landscape is a man-made construction, so that landscape is an existing place that's been contributed onto by and shaped by all the people who've lived and worked in this part of the country. And how am I going to be making a contribution to that place? What am I going to be replacing by building something in this location? So how do you start designing for a green field? It's not a blank piece of white paper, if there is such a thing. What are the first moves when you're building in a green field? How do you know what the right thing is going to be for this place? So in reflecting on this, I started by looking at how the landscape is manipulated to fulfill human needs. Just a bit of a location for where that site is. So those of you who are familiar with the southwest of England, it's in this kind of area between the southwest and the kind of chalk band which runs down through the centre of the south coast, and it's a very kind of complicated kind of geological setting, and the project is based on the spring line in the Blackdown Hills, which is this very kind of particular datum, at just over 200 meters above sea level, where a very permeable upper greensand sort of plateau and capping to the Blackdown Hills meets a very impermeable Mercia mudstone, and you get this remarkable condition of this spring line where water comes out of the ground, and you get this amazing ecology and conditions to which one can build, and that becomes a kind of a datum by which you can read how occupation has happened historically in this landscape. So that datum follows. You can trace a line around the hills, and you find communities traditionally based below the spring line, the villages, where they would make use of the springs and the water and so on for everyday use and so on. It's also a lot more the ground is a lot more fertile below the spring line in the clay valleys, and the actual plateau and the cappings are much more kind of exposed and sparse landscape. So my site on the spring line on the Black Downs is part of this kind of existing network of communities which relate to that location. And you can see that there's this kind of pattern that results from that, of this clustering of buildings and communities. That there isn't a very kind of centralized village pattern and so on. It's very much to do with a very kind of dispersed development, focused around farms, focused around activities and processes and things that happen in the landscape. And this project at Steep, as it's shown on this plan, will be part of that pattern that already exists in the landscape. And we can kind of read the way that people have historically built on that landscape, often very closely related to existing boundaries, existing kind of thresholds between ownership territories or between geological or watercourse boundaries and patterns that exist there in the landscape. And so we look at how farm buildings in particular, which are the predominant kind of building type, relate to those existing parts of the landscape, as well as the sort of farm buildings, the farmhouses, of which this house is a kind of relates to a farmhouse and also relates to farm buildings. And we can read not only the buildings that are done in that built in that landscape relating to the topography and activity, but also hedges, which are the incredibly kind of powerful organizing structure for the landscape in this very man-made landscape. They provide definitions of ownership of territory, of management of stock, and all of those sorts of things. But they're also this really important shelter to activities in the landscape, to buildings, to wildlife, to farm animals, to people. And they're also this kind of cropping device, which as a managed type of coppice, if you like, is part of how the landscape is managed. So that the hedges were really important to me in kind of understanding what a building that was manipulating an existing kind of fieldscape that was there could do to contribute to that landscape. And so for one of the first things that I looked at was looking at the kind of historical evidence of how that landscape has changed in the current field pattern compared to, say, for instance, this middle 19th century tide map. And it occurs that there's an existing, there was a historical plantation that ribbons around the south of the site, and of which there are residue trees from that plantation within the site. And so I got really interested in the idea of how hedges actually have a relationship to a history of woodland in the landscape, and that when Oliver Rackham who talks about hedges can be thought about as a ghost of woodlands that existed historically. And they are happen as a result of default. So a hedge can happen as a result of something being taken away rather than something intentionally being planted. Hedges, obviously, they're sort of formal things that you can think about hedges as kind of quite sculptural things. We find evidence of those in ecclesiastical carving. We feel it in the light and all of those sorts of things. But I was less interested in those more decorative qualities of a hedge, but thinking more about the sort of formal and practical space which hedges create in the landscape. So growing up as a farmer myself, just remembering all the times when a hedge provides shelter, A hedge provides something that's forming a boundary to activities that you're doing in the landscape, as well as in lots of ways forming an architecture of the landscape and the countryside. The hedges and the black downs are this very particular beech type growth, which often is very poorly managed and grown out and becomes this very kind of key feature of the landscape. I'm very interested in the way that we could think about beech hedges as a structure in their own right, as a kind of a truss, a sort of a cantilevering truss that's coming out of the ground. And I became interested in this very particular jointed cruck construction method, which is very unique to this particular part of Devon. And it's a kind of a hybridized traditional crook truss that's made of individual components and works really well within kind of quite heavy cob walls, which are traditional for this part of England. And so I did a survey of within a very close locality within that site, within half a mile of the site, I was able to survey about 5 different historical examples of this crook truss, which again started to build up this idea of this vocabulary of construction and structure that this building was going to be about. Also recognizing this kind of very close resonance to the very, very pragmatic, practical, contemporary use of portalized frames in traditional agricultural barns, as well as more commercial buildings. So that led to a language of construction in the building and a form of structural framework and grid that was really forms the sort of spine to the building and organizes spaces and construction methods and so on that the design evolved from. The story wasn't just about that form of truss, though. It was also about what the truss was made of. And the Black Downs are full of beech trees, which I talked about before. And it's this, within the UK, the 94,000 hectares. There's about, which is statistically, it's half as much as oak. We think about building with oak. Oak is used ubiquitously for all sorts of construction. Certainly was used much more historically. Beech now is pretty much predominantly used for firewood and so on. And so it's this really underutilized material. So part of one of the agendas of the project was to think about how that material could be used. On the continent, there's this heritage of using barbouche, which is this highly engineered, factory processed glue laminated type of timber, which is used almost as a kind of swap-in material instead of steel. Thank you to Toby, who's in the audience, I think, who pointed me to that product. It's also used in experimental ways, like at Hook, where beech has been used in as a sort of scanned material, but it's not, to my knowledge or anyone else involved in the team, been used kind of commercially with this in this country. And so, working with local sawmills, we chopped down a lot of beech trees, and they were air dried and then kiln dried, and then Buckland timber in Crediton glue laminated this beech to form the structure of the building. And the construction generally wrapped around that. There's also a traditional stick-built timber frame which encloses the insulation and so on. And this is the resulting space and enjoyment of the building itself refers to this material, refers to that kind of feeling of the landscape, and also makes use of a kind of palette of resonant materials that are also to do with that site and unique to there, but also has a kind of wider relevance. And we also looked at other things. So that this plank and muntin screen is made with ash from ash dieback felled trees and so on. So there's a sort of palette of other timbers that were used within the building. So beech was really important. That was a material to do with the site. We also thought about other things that, again, just thinking about what can be harvested, thinking about the landscape as this kind of space that can be a resource to be used sustainably. What else can we look at and use chert is a flint type nodule which sprouts out of the ground more or less. Frost heave brings it to the surface. Very difficult for mowing and hay and all of those sorts of things, but it's everywhere. And when farmers are trying to improve farmland, it's literally harvested, you know, with potato picker type machines. The pile on the bottom of the screen there is field harvested chert, which we've used within the building. You can see how it also becomes quite, you know, it's quite an important part of hedgerows. Anything that erodes eventually leaves this kind of material. There's this really particular quality within this part of the landscape. And early on, I looked at using that material because it's very beautiful, very kind of sort of a translucent golden brown color, doing experiments, making terrazzo or other sorts of materials that could make use of that material as part of the sort of thermal mass of the building, within which otherwise would be a fairly lightweight insulated timber frame construction. And we've used it for things like retaining garden walls and those sorts of things within the project. Really lovely material. Iron was really important. Opposite the other side of the lane from the site was a historical blacksmith. There is a history, a prehistorical story of iron ore extraction and processing and so on the Black Downs, and it's also really kind of characteristic part of how agricultural activity manages the landscape, and with these interventions of gates and fences and buildings and cladding and so on, and it's really key part of the language of what's there. And so that became also part of the some of the cladding materials that we used for some of the parts of the building and so on, in conjunction with sweet chestnut, which was also locally sourced, sawn, not planed, and used for the cladding the building generally. This is a root ball from site at the very beginning, which was one of the kind of clues to the sort of palette materials that I was interested in, where you get this spalting of the beach, you get the embedded bits of chert, you get the cuts, the sort of erosion and corrosion that happens, and a lot of the language of the materials and so on in the building were in that kind of moment at that earlier stage. So I talked about materials and these things which come from site, and there's also the resource of the environment in order for the building to operate, and the building to also contribute to be part of a kind of habitat for wider animals and wildlife and invertebrates and all of those sorts of things. And there's a whole suite of things to do with the brown roof on the itself, crevices for bats and other wildlife, owl boxes, all sorts of things, which I'm not going to go into now, as well as the landscape itself, which includes a very large enhancement to the ecological potential of the site from what it is at the moment. It's just a sort of a field space. And so there was a sort of strategy to do with short and long term, where we could get energy for the site, including planting biomass, as well as getting things from the site short term. Short term, there's a ground source heat pump, which makes use of the soggy ground to draw heat, to heat the very well highly insulated space. So just very quickly, this idea of the sort of process of the design of the building, just at the beginning was this very simple idea of remembering that there was this plantation there and thinking about how the building kind of connected to that edge of this memory of the plantation that was there, and also looking at the way that hedge and other trees sort of symbiotically related to each other and held each other up. And that's some of the ideas in the building. There's a very long process to do with the design of the building and getting approval for it and all of those sorts of things, which this is a very long snapshot of, which I'm not going to go into all of the detail of that, but that's another story in its own right. But ultimately, this is where the building sits within the landscape. It's there. If you see my mouse, maybe in the middle there. This is an illustration I've done. I did of it before it was built, just to kind of show that it was appropriate and scale and everything to what was already there. part of the designing for this place is about letting go of a lot of the decisions that I make as a designer, though. And one of the things that was kind of important to me, and part of the building was about letting all of the different makers make their mark in the building, which did result in quite a lot of surprise in some ways. But it was actually really important, this idea for all the different people who are involved in it, as well as me, because I think that's really important to placemaking. So it started with Richard and Sue standing in that field and making that call, that really ambitious call that they wanted to build a house there, and anticipating what that could be like and supporting it all the way through a very long time. Tom Bedford and his forestry team and sawmill processed the timber for us for that beach, and Robin Nicholson and his team with Button Timber structurally designed, tested this material that they had never used before, in which there wasn't evidence of being used in Britain, and made that work and backed it and supported that. On site we had Andy and Bruce carpentry team for all the sort of site-built carpentry works, of which I've not looked at now, but there's a whole other sort of layer of work that was cut and made on site. Dave, who built meters and meters of chert wall and all sorts of things in the baking sun of the summer. The team from Wellington who built the kitchen from just over the hill. Kevin Stopforth, who made the stairs and made the ash screen, and has made a dining table for Richard and Sue out of ash, and as part of that sort of team and story. And Richard and Sue themselves, who were there supporting this whole project, just endlessly fascinated by everything that everyone was doing, and wanting everyone to, really be proud of what they're doing and be part of that sort of making the mark in the landscape, which they, have very significantly kind of financially supported. So just to kind of conclude, the idea of the hedge, which is this building, was that it's a habitat for people made by people. I think that if you follow this journey, if you think about pairing the binary of design and technology, it's very difficult to tease sort of terms apart. Is this a technology-driven building, or all the design moves technology-driven by material and site conditions and construction methods and environmental design and so on? And if it is technology-driven, is it architecture? And I think that if you follow that argument and you inverse the idea, you can make the argument that all of the pragmatic, technology-driven, vernacular and pragmatic agricultural buildings in the locality are in fact architecture. They are architecture not made by architects. They are architecture because they're embedded in their place. They offer a reading of possibility and opportunity which capitalizes on what is available in this place, the materials, environment, resources, and life which a place means, manipulates, and ultimately they provide a habitat for a new generation. So these sorts of buildings in the landscape are a habitat which is fundamentally forward-looking, positive and generous. Anything which makes place, I would argue, can be architecture, regardless of whether there's a designer involved, called an architect. In some ways, this is a bit of an apologia for my architect. I have had to make architecture which is very, very complex in this situation in order to get planning permission, and to demonstrate a certain level of innovation and so on. And in lots of ways, I kind of look very nostalgically at buildings like this, building built a mile further around on the spring line, in lots of ways following very sort of similar rules about how you build in this location. And I think it'd be really great to be able to have the sort of sheer focus and forethought and contingency to build something as kind of simple as a barn like this. Just remembering the idea that the building and the hedge is the result of what's being left behind rather than what we put in its place. And that's what that kind of memory might be. Okay, I know we started a bit late, and hopefully I've not overrun too much, but I'd like to hand over to Maria now, who's going to talk about another way that place is made. And then after Maria's spoken, I think we're going to welcome people to ask us questions and talk a bit more about how our work relates. So,
thank you, Justin. Thank you. And there's a wonderful overlap between our work, which is all about placemaking, and there are also incredible other implications, another level of implications that we'll look at. So I'm talking now. Justin just passed over the baton to me. The technical production of space, and what is the role of the architect really in a larger scale implications of the social production of space. So I'm going to give a talk now with also some details, which are very grounding, but also some theory and some larger scale implications on how we build cities, and particularly talking about spatial justice. And what is spatial justice? Spatial justice is the coming together of social justice and human rights with space. We know that particularly in urban centers, the way that we organize and the way that we produce and who produces space has an incredible impact on the justices or injustices that take place in those spaces. And I'm paraphrasing from Henri Lefebvre and David Harvey, and this will happen quite a lot through this talk. So that if we want to find ways and methods of dealing with injustices, we need to take a very close look at how space and society together have implications, how they are organized. And the fundamental question is based on two debates. One is about distribution issues, and the other debate really is all about decision-making processes and engagement. So social justice is often a kind of thing we take for granted. Often people think it's about an event, or they think that we can provide a service and deal with spatial justice. But in fact, in order to deal with most of the social injustices that take place in our rural and urban centers, it is a deeper question, a much more political, economic question. And the architect is involved because fundamentally, most of these things need spatial recognition. They take place in spaces, and they get verified and validated through places. So this is a kind of approach, and excuse the first few slides that are a little bit text heavy, and I promise all the second set of slides is just images. It's a way to think about the built environment and bringing together the social and human rights elements. So it isn't about, as I mentioned, about facilitating an event. Rather, it is about creating the context so that self-organization can happen against this neoliberal organization. Importantly, David Harvey and Henri Lefebvre were working from Karl Marx's position and his kind of guess of what would happen to the neoliberal world, most of which has come true. The role of the architect is a slightly different role. We don't have the possibility to simply just produce a project and ask that it offers affordances in social justice. It is rather the deep observing skills that the architect has to be able to implement a contextual response in order to deal with very deep class issues as well. So inhabitation of the city is a political act. And that means that when we think about freedom, it is not a passive or inactive right. So everyday acts produce meaning in the city. And so you will hear this, and I'm sure you've heard it already, but Right to the City, RTTC, as you will see, is all about our use of freedom in order to change our lives. Part of changing our lives is about having access to agency and social mobility. And inherently, that means that we as people are able to do that. not that architects do that for people. So to inhabit, and to paraphrase again from Lefebvre and Harvey, is to appropriate the social production of the city and its very means of production. And what you'll see through the images and different organizations is that they will be either working through and responding to distribution or being part of decision-making processes. So generally, and this is very generally because I do see also connections with what Justin was talking about as well, but generally the right to the city movement is focused on a dignified life for people who form part of the lower aspects, the groups of the 99%, the socioeconomic groups that are struggling in the poorer communities, disenfranchised, excluded, marginalized groups. Just very briefly, as a kind of, examples of what's happening in the world, we'll look at a very quick look at organizations in Brazil, South Africa, Spain, and as well as the UK. So these are the 4 organizations we'll be looking at very briefly. So Architects for Social Housing is a key social justice group led by architects in the UK. And what they do essentially is bring together data to circumvent what the general thinking is on housing, for example. And I've just quoted from one of their reports on housing stock in England. The most important thing here to know is that the majority of house land ownership and then property ownership are unknown listed agencies that are outside the UK. So when we hear the rhetoric that there isn't enough housing, actually that's incorrect. So part of what Architects for Social Housing, and I encourage you to look them up, what they do is they actually dispel myths. What's important to know is that over 100,000 UK land titles are registered to anonymous companies. So when we think back to the right to the city and that first tenant, we talked about distribution of tenure, distribution of access to housing, and it's not about ownership, but it is access to affordability, affordable homes. In Brazil, where they have probably been leading the way on social justice for the rest of the world, there's a group called the Landless Workers Movement, and essentially they inhabit land that is not used and to allow rural workers to have tenure. And to date, 370,000 families have gained tenure because the movement was politically recognized by Brazil in 1984. And that was just an incredibly profound and fantastic movement. We look at Portugal. There's a specific organization called the 99%. And they reinforce the idea that social justice really is a collective issue, a collective question. So it's not about wealth for individuals. It is about access to tenure and land rights for large groups of people, and specifically people who are suffering from how a system works as a whole. So, and again, this group is also led by architects. Architects have a very specific and large-scale view, as well as a grounded and detailed view of how tenure and ownership and design decisions and planning and urban design come together. And of course, there's a kind of territorial organization of space, because there's a whole other group of theories related to segregation and exclusion that also are in the remit of how planners and architects work. And the last organization we'll look at here is in Spain, and they focus specifically on homelessness, and there's a whole range of how people are homeless. Even people in precarious houses are considered housing and considered homeless, precarious tenure. And these are probably the 4 strongest organizations in the world today leading the way on spatial justice. So generally, and I'm sorry for all the text, generally the right to the city movement does focus on the poorer class. But what we're going to look at through this presentation is some of the signs of emerging spatial justice. Okay, and so here are some quotes which I think would be just really important to set the scene. Specialization of injustice and the injustice of spatialization. So the emphasis is on the process. So we talked about the two arguments. One is distribution and one is about decision making. And we call that processes really. Implications on decisions related to social, economic, and political relations. So I'm going to quote here the premise that spatial dynamics play an essential role in the production and reproduction of injustice, but also that they permit as well as prohibit the formation of rights claims and the ways and extent to which rights are put into action and practiced. So spatial justice isn't a product. It's not something that we can design. We are in older schools of thought in architecture, we were taught that we could design a solution to happen. But in fact, it is the layers of decision making, it is the layers of processes that take place before any kind of product that takes place, where we can ensure the implications and ownership and sense of ownership and unfold. So a thing is not just or unjust, but it is actually about the dynamics of justice. And that's where all of our empathy as architects comes into play. And these take place as much in the global north as the global south, as we've already seen from two of the organizations. And when I go through silently through some of the images later, you'll be able to think about what those mean in each of the contexts. So I have some long definitions here. We are essentially going to be thinking about gentrification, thinking about market-driven urban development, but I'm not going to stay on these slides. I want to focus rather on creative destruction, which actually encompasses the ideas of gentrification. The process of creative destruction essentially is about the idea that in order to have access to lands for redevelopment, we destroy what currently exists. When we think about the extraction industry, for example, mining or oil, we choose places in the world where it's okay to destroy what's on the land. When we undertake major redevelopment, architecture and planning redevelopment, it is important to we factor in the cost of what we're destroying. And if what we're destroying has a large penalty, then it's difficult to do that. So for example, why does gold mining take place in poorer regions of West Africa? If there was a gold thread through Europe, which by the way, there is, it's very unlikely you would be evicting and relocating people who live in countries in France. You could imagine the cost. You can imagine the fact that people know their rights and would be unwilling to agree that moving is in the better and the betterment of the economy nationally overcomes their personal rights or the rights of the collective of people who are being removed. So creative destruction is about destroying with the fundamental idea that it's worthwhile for the people who are then going to create over top. I'm going to look at some of these examples. Here's just on a lighter note, but also profound. It's a gentrification scorecard that I found incredibly interesting. And some of these ways that we keep score, from the neoliberal side. Again, this feels a lot more like a lecture than Justin's excellent talk. But as I promised, there's lots of images coming up where you can just sit back and think. This table I really want to include, even though this is my very open talk. Brenner and Theodore, they found a way to really encapsulate in this table all of the factors related to creative destruction in such a kind of clear way, and really we can find immediate examples in the contemporary world. So if you are interested in this, I really encourage you to find this. You can find this online and look more deeply into all of the tenets that led up to this table. It's about the transformation in urban space. It's about the re-regularization of civil society. And really, really importantly, it's about re-representing the city. These are the things that happen in the transformation towards a more unjust cities. So if we look at it, what exactly does it mean, creative destruction? This is quite poignant and really brings home in a really irksome way. This is what happens in the global north and the global south. But when you look at it in this kind of density, it's really deeply compelling. This is how many people are being evicted in order to produce what's on the right. And you can bet that none of the people being evicted will be the tenants on the right. The people on the left who have been there for different generations and have a sense of ownership. It's where they make their living. City space and built forms are embedded in kind of historic social processes. And as Harvey described it, spatial forms are not inanimate objects within which social processes unfold, but they are things which contain social processes in the same manner that social processes are spatial. So the call of spatial justice is for a kind of a political and philosophical reference for scholars, for architects, for anybody involved in the built environment at the physical end, at the political end, to engage with social justice and the urban conditions under which capitalism leads the way, under which really the 1% makes the decisions apart from what already exists. The right to the city is really, just a second. The right to the city is a kind of form of rights, a kind of a call for a collective endeavor, really. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. Okay, so freedom really shouldn't be equated with the ability to retreat, but rather it is about political interference, and freedom is a political concept that requires interaction, worldly space to make its appearance. And that's where the spatial component comes in. So freedom is achieved through action. It's not a preconceived goal. It's not a product. And where we play a role as architects is to think multi-layered and to think contextual. How do we create spaces for a kind of self-determination and agency? And if freedom emerges from social and political practices, which then transform the conditions that have produced unfreedom, and unfreedom is a term coming from Harold Bauder. I have 2 pages of references, which you will be able to kind of capture when you look at the videos. And now, the catalysts for agency as a kind of recap in the context are part of the context of inequity and injustice. So in taking a kind of lesson, Le Corbusier used to give these talks to the public, and he used to play over 200 slides and not say a word. He relied on incredible interest and intelligence of his audience. And so I'm just going to say in the next slides, I'm not going to say anything. And I would just like you to observe freedom from, freedom to, in a range of images that run the ideas of social injustice from the two debates of distribution and design processes and engagement. Okay, so I think we have about 10 minutes left. And Justice, will you come? Justin, will you come back? Justice, I'm calling you social justice now. In case there are any questions, or did everyone see the link between the talks? And
perhaps if anyone wants to ask a question, they could either put it in the chat or they could use the raise hand function, and then we can get to you.
Well, I can just start by saying, I mean, I found Justin's talk so grounding. You can see materials and the steps and kind of direction on what to do and an understanding. And the ideas of social justice are not as material and grounded and much more difficult to grasp. But when they take place, you can see those catalysts. And so great to have any questions. Okay.
Where if some of those moments that you showed in those fascinating slides at the end show incredible kind of creativity and ingenuity and kind of resourcefulness by people with very limited resources, which is kind of in some ways the opposite of my project, that it was a project that was, you know, well resourced. Do you think that a lack of material resources is a prompt to creativity?
What a wonderful question. I think I think that word creativity is an interesting one. if it, you know, we know it when we set assignments, you know, the more limited, the more you know, you have these kind of really creative responses. In a situation where there's like a level of desperation as well, it's incredible what the human mind will come up with. Because I guess you know, those two questions of distribution of access to housing and being able to make a living and aspects of social mobility. And then the decision making within cities and rural areas too. I think, yeah, I do think that that's a prompt. But I think when it's laced with creativity, it's like it explodes. Creativity explodes. You know, what do you think?
I think it's really, in some ways it can be quite easy to say people need to be more creative with the resources that they have, and people can do a lot with a very limited amount of resources. If they are creative, somehow it can be an excuse for not giving people, you know, enough to get on with. It's a very difficult one because we can celebrate creativity with people doing a lot with very little, but then it's a danger when that becomes an excuse for you know, a political excuse often for not, you know, giving people the basics of a resource, whether that's land or materials or time or whatever it might be.
I think, I mean, I think there's room, absolutely room for wealth, you know, in society. It's just when the decision making is limited to the other, you know, what they're calling the 99%. And when their ability to make a dignified life is limited because decision making is not in their hands. And when cities are designed in ways that, you know, the dramatic creative destruction, but even in the minor ways that evolutions happen in cities, not just clearances, but where things are designed for very specific people to occupy, it continues that message of who's important and, you know, who are making the decisions to you know, to evolve those places. So it's not so much about, you know, it's not so much about giving something. It's more looking at the systems within which we allow decisions to be made. It's decisions that, you know, decide how land is appropriated, that decide systems that allow, you know, foreign ownership, so much foreign ownership, especially in the UK. It's one of the worst really places in the world for foreign ownership. And not even just foreign, but unknown. So a lot of those land titles are unknown people where, you know, the incomes that are coming in, even if it's you know, wealthy incomes, they don't go back to the tax base of the UK. So it's, and then when we go back to the problem of not enough housing or not enough fair tenure, it's kind of being strangled by that larger system that allowed that to be in place. I mean, there's cities like Vienna that right from the Second World War onwards, the government really has control over almost all of the land in the city. And that means that tenure is equally distributed. It's one of the best examples in the world. And so that, you know, it's that system, and it's not a system that gives housing or, you know, gives tenure. It's a system that actually controls the fair distribution of tenure. So and it, you know, and it is kind of architectural thinking if people in the built environment who can see that large scale use of land. Okay, so I think we're kind of time's up here. Justin, I want to say thank you so much for giving this presentation. And for everybody for coming, and I hope that was interesting for everybody. Kind of foray into social justice and into this wonderful project in the rural area with Justin. So
thanks,
Jody.
Maria. It's really important for all of us in practice in particular who have our own silos that we work in to kind of be reminded of the whole diversity of different ways that we can engage with things. So
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, just a thank you for me as well. Thank you, Maria and Justin, for giving up your time, and thanks everyone for attending. The recording will go on to the RIBA Studio YouTube channel, so if you do want to catch up on it again, anything you missed or the references that Maria mentioned, you can do so that way. We've got another session at the same time next week as well, so please do look out for some sort of marketing and usual links for that as well. It'll be all circulated early next week, so hopefully you can join us then as well. And if you're watching on catch up, hello from us too, and have a great weekend, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.